Hello gentlemen, this is CS MGTOW. A number of MGTOW YouTubers, including No Holds Barred and Turd Flinging Monkey, have addressed a very important issue, and that is the issue of male unemployment that is now becoming a feature of the economic system in the Western world and the impact on male quality of life and well-being. A number of solutions have been advocated, such as the move to a resource-based economy, which has been proposed by No Holds Barred, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting his position. Turd Flinging Monkey sits firmly on the other side of the fence and has stated in a number of videos that a free market capitalistic system is the optimal arrangement for the human species in general and men in particular. This video is a response of sorts to the latest video by TFM, Economic and Social Models Part 1, The Free Market. My video is part of a series. To keep their length manageable, I'm going to be releasing them in blocks. I've already scripted the second part in the series. In the second video in the series, I'll be more directly comparing a pure free market with a resource-based economy and scientific meritocracy. This video will serve as the much-needed background. What I will attempt to do in this first video is to compare the key economic systems with a specific emphasis on a number of variables. Where evidence exists, I will of course refer to it to back up any claims I make. Where there's little evidence, I will have to make an educated guess. However, I will be very, very clear as to where I'm making an educated guess and what thought patterns led to my conclusions. So while I will be attempting to identify what is the best society for men from my own very, very narrow point of view, I am of course aware that individuals often have an express preference in terms of the economic and social order that they would prefer to live under. Some men prefer a mild socialism. Some men prefer totalitarian communism. Many, myself included, would prefer some sort of a free market system with a little but not a whole deal of state involvement. And some men, of course, are hardened fascists. Before I get into the heart of this video, I will also say that there are really no solutions to human problems, only trade-offs. I believe that this quote is attributed to Thomas Sowell, and I find it a very, very fitting statement, especially within the context of this video's topic. So, the quality of life measures that I will aim to compare with this video include male unemployment levels. Number 2, pair bonding dynamics that result from the economic system in question. Number 3, male life expectancy. Number 4, misandry. Number 5, male versus male competition. And number 6, other trade-offs that arise from the economic or social system in question. I will be comparing 4 systems. They are the barter system. Here I will have to look at both prehistory agrarian and hunter-gatherer type societies out of necessity more than anything else, since to the best of my knowledge, no large-scale, well-studied barter system still exists in the Western world. The second system I will compare is that of the monetary semi-capitalistic system, otherwise known as a mixed economy. I define this as a kind of semi-free market with some government involvement, the kind of system seen in most, if not all, Western-style democracies, where you can own a business and the government will regulate to protect consumers, the environment, and collect taxes to be spent on the common welfare. Thirdly, I will compare a resource-based economy. And lastly, I will compare the command economy, as typified by current-day North Korea or the pre-1991 Soviet Union, where independent economic activity was frowned upon and oftentimes actually illegal. Now, while there are, of course, other important economic and social systems, in the interests of brevity, I cannot explore them all in a single video and still hope to keep your attention. Okay, the first system is the barter system. Firstly, there's the false notion that thankfully isn't particularly prevalent within MGTOW, that unemployment does not exist under a barter system. Just a little bit of thought tells us that without the double coincidence of wants, you are for all intents and purposes unemployed. If you have spent all summer harvesting wool, and not a soul within 50 miles wants to trade your wool with food, you will starve. What is sadly lacking is, of course, research on the frequency of occurrence of the double coincidence of wants. I realize that it's one of the two extremes of the barter system. You will either find a person who wants the goods you have to trade. This will be, of course, from your point of view, 100% employment, or you won't, and then you are, for all intents and purposes, unemployed. So here I will guess that about 80% of the time you will not be able to find a suitable trade for your goods. Now this can be reduced, of course, by asking your neighbors in advance if they desire a commodity such as wool or arrowheads, and then making them specifically to order to trade with their wheat or carrots. Things can go wrong, of course. Their carrot crop might fail. They might have a more urgent need than arrowheads come up. So let's reduce this number to 50%. So about 50% of the time, let's say you'll be unable to find a suitable trade for your goods. Pair bonding is a necessity under the barter system. Since the labor market is relatively undeveloped, most jobs are fully or at least partially manual labor, requiring the kind of high physical strength possessed by males. So women will absolutely need men to pair bond with. Not finding a man is exceptionally disadvantageous to a woman. Here males do and absolutely will have the upper hand in the battle of the sexes. The constant economic uncertainty will necessitate pair bonding patterns, particularly long-term pair bonding, or what we might term a marriage. Men can be sure of fidelity, since the economic consequences of infidelity on a woman will be exceptionally severe. A threat to expel her from her home always hangs over her head, and it's a compelling threat, since her expulsion leads directly to her starvation. So the man really does rule the roost, due to the fact that there is a very real and visible connection between his presence in labor and the survival of those around him. As a result, you'll find there's very, very little misandry. However, he pays for such an exalted social status dearly, with being hyper-disposable. For example, should an enemy tribe raid, he will be expected to lay down his life to defend his clan, women, and children. In terms of his lifespan, according to an article on ancientorigins.net, once infant mortality rates are removed, the lifespan for a prehistory hunter-gatherer were about 70 to 80 years. The biggest trade-off that a man living within a barter system will face is, in my opinion, the increased rates of death by violence. Per capita death rates by violence in stateless societies were, and are actually, much more violent than modern states. Without a neutral, powerful third party, i.e., the government, to mediate disputes and claim the monopoly on the use of force, violence seems to reign supreme. This is another point conveniently ignored by the hardcore libertarians out there. When we don't have a state, men die in much greater numbers than when Leviathan is present. The traditional view of a peaceful forager suffers from argumentum excellentio. That is, a conclusion drawn from the lack of evidence for or against the theory. Evidence presented by Steven Pinker in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, suggests that a man living within a stateless barter economy of the North American plains would have to contend with a homicide rate of up to 1,000 per 100,000. To get a feel for what this number means, keep in mind that the safest place in human history, Western Europe, at the turn of the 21st century, had a homicide rate in the neighborhood of 1 per 100,000. Among modern Western countries, the United States lies at the dangerous end of the range. In the worst years of the 1970s and 1980s, it had a homicide rate of around 10 per 100,000, and in its notoriously violent cities, such as Detroit, at a rate of around 45 per 100,000. If you were living in a society with a homicide rate in that range, you would notice the danger in everyday life. As the rate climbed to 100 per 100,000, the violence would start to affect you personally, assuming you have 100 relatives, friends, and close acquaintances. Then over the course of a decade, one of them would probably be killed. If the rate soared to 1,000 per 100,000, that is 1%, you lose about one acquaintance a year, and you would have a better than even lifetime chance of being murdered yourself. So this is quite a huge issue. So in summary for the barter system, male unemployment levels around 50%, pair bonding dynamics that result, well, you have marriage, but you also have extreme male disposability. When we look at the male life expectancy, expects to live about 70 to 80 years. Well, you won't notice a lot of misandry. You can expect to have pretty severe and lethal male versus male competition. And in terms of the other trade-offs from the economic and social system in question, high homicide rates, and homicides will of course disproportionately affect men. I'm going to be looking at the mixed economy. According to the World Bank, the US male unemployment rate is 6.3%. This is currently on a downward trend from 2011 when it was 9.4%. The actual rate is of course likely much higher. However, since this leads me into the realm of speculation, I'll stick with the government numbers. Pair bonding, the kind favored by traditionalists, has collapsed in much of the Western world. Marriage rates are down. Men now compete with a woman's employer and the state in the realms of provisioning and protection respectively. The individual man has an almost unassailable disadvantage in such a dynamic. As a result, hypergamy has rendered the majority of relationships as nothing more than arrangements of unbalanced servitude towards the female. Men rarely get their basic needs met in modern relationships. It is very, very much a seller's market, with women of course being the sellers or the sex merchants, as Stardust once said. The expectations of male disposability still exist. However, even the minuscule returns enjoyed by men in the past, such as guarantees of sexual fidelity, are now much harder to come by. The juice is simply not worth the squeeze for many men, hence the MGTOW phenomenon. According to the World Bank, life expectancy is currently 78.4 years for men, and there is of course the outrageous double standards present within the legal system to show that misandry is likely at an all-time high. Violence towards men is trivialized across society and satirized in the media. Men face a number of unfortunate trade-offs in the mixed economy. For example, males make up the majority of suicides across the majority of the world, to the point that suicide is the leading cause of death among men below the age of 50 in the UK where I happen to live. Men also make up the majority of homeless and persons incarcerated. Society openly tolerates ideas suggesting a termination of members of the male sex. Men are treated as second-class citizens, pay the majority of taxes, and are often barred from the majority of state services through affirmative action, gender-based quotas, or outright hostility and discrimination. Men serve longer sentences for the same crime as women, and a rape epidemic is currently taking place in the prison system. Another unfortunate feature of the mixed economy is that the male versus male competition turns lethal, even in an otherwise safe society. We of course have violent white knighting the norm, and male policing other males so they behave a certain way towards women. I covered the reasons for this in my video, The New Malthusian Trap. As the labor force opens to women, men lose their long-held advantage in resource provisioning and then end up in a lifelong marathon to maintain their value in the eyes of women. Within a mixed economy, men will often form the social underclass, as the mixed economy supports a very specific type of men. Other men who in days gone by might have learned a trade as an apprentice often face lifelong and perhaps even intergenerational unemployment through no fault of their own. Within a mixed economy, you have a pretty brutal sorting out based on criteria the average man cannot easily overcome or plan for, things such as IQ, height, accent, educational levels, or even ethnic background do play a role in your employability. Let's say, for example, that your parents lack the foresight to ensure you received an excellent education. This is obviously no fault of your own, but within a mixed economy, your fate can be sealed from a very early age, and if you end up on the wrong end of the fence, you will have few options to rise. Men become social underclasses because of the human reproductive arrangement, where women can trade her reproductive capabilities for provisioning. This allows a less skilled but highly attractive woman to find an easy lifelong meal ticket. Men, of course, do not have the biological equipment to benefit from such an evolutionary lottery. Evidence of this can be seen in article after article, where the press are quite rightly pointing to the fact that men now make up the new economic underclass. An article by The Guardian reported that many men struggled just to meet their basic living costs, and as much as 20% of men who were contacted by the charity in question in the article reported a drop in their income. Another article by the Fiscal Times reported that millennial men are faring especially poorly. Male unemployment is higher than female unemployment. Male labor force participation is lower than in prior generations. Their hourly wage is less than it was in the early 1970s, and male educational attainment is increasingly slipping behind women, which doesn't bode well for the future. While the economic uncertainty I've presented above will certainly be present within all other economic systems, based on the results of my research, which admittedly is limited to PubMed studies and Google, it's within the mixed economy, or the more kind of free market type economies, that the financial prospects of males and females can be so different. Within other economic systems, both genders seem to suffer when things get rough. When you have a more mixed economy or free market type setup, things get rough for men who are, of course, as a group, still in social roles as providers and breadwinners, expected to make the lion's share of financial contributions to the home. Women, of course, are less expected to do so, and they, of course, also have Big Daddy government taxing men for the benefit of the female electorate. Under a free market or mixed economy, hypergamy is lifted. That is, the chains of hypergamy are let go due to mechanization, and men suffer often a cruel economic fate. So, let's compare this. We have male unemployment levels at about 6.3%. Pair bonding dynamics that result from this economic system in question, well, male disposability. Hypergamy becomes maladaptive. Relationships become arrangements of unbalanced servitude by men towards women. Male life expectancy is 78.4 years. We absolutely have misandry, open hostility and contempt for the male sex, numerous legal and social disadvantages for being a man. In terms of male versus male competition, it descends into violence and ridicule as men compete for sexual access to females. Other trade-offs from this economic and social system in question, well, male suicide is rampant, male homelessness is rampant. Men find it hardest to adapt their skills to changes in economic situations. The third system is, of course, the resource-based economy. The term and meaning of a resource-based economy was originated by Jack Fresco. It is a holistic socio-economic system in which all goods and services are available without the use of money, credits, barter, or other system of debt or servitude. Because there have been very, very few examples of true resource-based economies, this is the area where I will have to do most of the speculation. But to allow a resource-based economy a proper defense, so to speak, I'm going to reach into history for an example of its implementations. Most Americans are familiar, of course, with the story of the Puritans landing at Plymouth Rock in 1620. But few perhaps understand their early experiment with what we would now term a resource-based economy, or perhaps even socialism. Prior to their departure from Europe, the Pilgrims did not have enough funds to outfit for the journey and establish a colony. So they sought help from the Virginia Company of London and the Virginia Company of Plymouth, companies known as adventurers, which were organized to fund and equip colonial enterprises. One of the key points of the contract between the Pilgrims and the adventurers said that all colonists were to get their food, clothing, drink, and provisions from the colony's common stock of goods. In addition, during the first 7 years, all profits earned by the colonists would go into the common stock until they were divided. Dr. Judd W. Patton, who is a professor of economics at Bellevue University in Nebraska, is perhaps the single most complete authority for the story of the Pilgrims and the early years of the colony. He wrote, "Today, we would call this a socialist commune. In other words, the Pilgrims accepted the manifesto, and these are his words, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Each person was to place his production in the common warehouse and receive back through the governor only what he needed for himself or his family. The surplus after 7 years was to be divided equally along with the houses, land, and chattels." Patton wrote that after landing on the 21st of December 1620, the Pilgrims suffered horribly their first winter, with around half the colonists perishing. Aid from the now famous Squanto helped them survive, with new planting techniques, but the harvests of 1621 and 1622 were still small. The colony's governor, William Bradford, wrote that its socialist philosophy greatly hindered its growth. Young men resented working for the benefit of other men's wives and children without compensation. Healthy men who worked thought it unjust that they received no more food than weak men who could not. Wives resented doing household chores for other men and considered it a kind of slavery. Governor Bradford wrote that to avoid famine in 1623, the Pilgrims abandoned socialism. Patton said, "At length, after much debate of things, the governor gave way that they should set corn, every man for his own particular, and in that regard trusted themselves in all other things to go on in the general way as before, and so assigned to each every family a parcel of land." Bradford wrote, "The colonists, each of whom now had to grow their own food, suddenly became very industrious, with women and children who early claimed weakness, now going into the fields to plant corn. 3 times the amount of corn was planted that year under the new system." The Plymouth colony's court records are also very interesting, as they provide a glimpse into the everyday life of the Pilgrims, albeit usually the negative side, of course. They provide insight into how the Pilgrims interpreted scripture and English law, and to look at their moral and religious values. In 1636, the Plymouth colony formally codified its 5 crimes that were punishable by death, that is, willful murder, forming a solemn compact with the devil by the way of witchcraft, willful burning of ships or houses, sodomy, rape, and buggery, and lastly adultery. When one analyzes the typical patterns of punishment under the system they had established, we find routine executions, branding of signs into foreheads, public whipping for adultery, and of course, the death penalty. We also find all manner of fines for failing to vote, fines for smoking 1 mile from your home. Now, I am 100% aware that under a true resource-based economy, that money would not exist, so fines, of course, would be a moot point. However, citizens would still need methods to deter undesirable behavior and a means to punish wrongdoing. And here we see quite readily that they reached for the death penalty, the hangman, and other punishments that we with our modern-day sensibilities would consider to be cruel and unusual. And I'm going to just go out on a limb here and say that a resource-based economy cannot exist for long without some form of command structure. Without a command structure, it will quickly disintegrate back into a mixed economy or perhaps even a free market. But with a command structure that it absolutely needs, it very, very quickly becomes a totalitarian economy. According to Wikipedia, in Plymouth colony, life expectancy was actually higher for men than women. Of the men who survived until the age of 21, the average life expectancy was 69.2 years. Over 55% of these men lived past 70. Less than 15% died before the age of 50. For women, the numbers are much lower, owing partially to the difficulties inherent in childbirth, and I'm also assuming the lack of medical facilities over there. The average life expectancy for women at the age of 21 was only 62.4 years. Of these women, less than 45% lived past 70, and about 30% died before the age of 50. So, again, let's review. Male unemployment levels, of course, were low. Secondly, the pair bonding dynamics that resulted from this resource-based economy, well, we have a traditionalist pair bond. And actually, in many ways, it's a traditionalist paradise because adultery is punishable by death or flogging. Well, that'll keep her in line, eh? Thirdly, male life expectancy, higher for men than women. Misandry is, of course, going to be super low. You can't afford to antagonize the men that you need in such a society. Male versus male competition, as far as we understand, was benign. And in terms of the other trade-offs of the economics, and social system in question, well, of course, you have male disposability. At 16, males become eligible for the military draft and have to, of course, provide for a family. The final system I'm going to be reviewing is that of the command economy. The command economy is characterized by government controls of all major aspects of the economy and economic production. For my analysis here, I'm going to be looking at the USSR since, at least to myself, it represents one of the most successful, by dint of its longevity, and well-studied command economies ever. According to a 1965 Time magazine article, the official unemployment rate in the Soviet Union is about 1.5% of the total workforce. Now, Kevin Hornbuckle may vehemently disagree with me, but I do take exception to the method by which the Soviets achieved such a low unemployment rate, which of course included forced labor camps, fondly known as gulags, outrageously long jail sentences, which involved heavy manual labor for even the most minor misdemeanors, collective farms, and a brutal, repressive internal passport system that, for all intents and purposes, chained all but the most politically connected persons to jobs for life. But in the interests of fairness, we will accept the 1.5% unemployment rate, and there's little evidence to suggest that men were unemployed compared to women in the USSR. According to the demographic analysis by Elizabeth Brainerd titled Marriage and Divorce in Revolutionary Russia, when the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, they intended to break down the traditional bourgeoisie structure of the family in order to equalize the status of men and women. They implemented a number of policies towards this end in subsequent years. In 1918, the Family Code secularized marriage, made divorce easily obtainable, and granted equal rights to illegitimate and legitimate children. In 1920, the Soviet Union became the first country in the world to legalize abortion. The procedure was legal and free if performed in a hospital, and the practice became widespread in the 1920s. The procedure for obtaining a divorce was remarkably simple. Under the new legislation, either spouse could request a divorce without specifying any grounds for the divorce. An uncontested divorce was registered in the local Bureau of Statistics, and Elizabeth then concluded that the cataclysmic events of 1914 to 1922 had a profound effect on family formation in Russia during this period. Marriage and birth rates, of course, declined sharply in 1914 to 1917 before recovering or exceeding earlier levels in the mid-1920s. Divorce became much more common, and for men, remarriage emerged as a new and widespread marital institution in the wake of divorce. Women were much more likely to remain divorced, apparently. So again, here we see that once a large governmental system is erected, whether it be in the form of a command economy or Western-style mixed economy, women gain their independence, have less children, divorce more, and choose to stay divorced. Marriage is an arrangement of necessity. When women can work, they will choose to go without the marriage contract. According to Emma Mason in her book Women in the Gulag in the 1930s, Mason estimates that in 1939, women only comprised 8.4% of the total Gulag population, and furthermore, initially, many camp commanders were reluctant to accept women as they believed they were weaker than men, and so would take longer to fulfill the work norms set by the Gulag administration. In 1941, the Central Camp Administration even sent a letter to the NKVD and camp commanders ordering them to accept convoys of women and listing jobs that women could be particularly useful for, such as textiles, wood and metal work, and light industry. On the topic of male life expectancy, Michael Ryan produced data addressing life expectancy and mortality data from the Soviet Union. It ranged from 44 years in 1938 to 65 years in 1936. Furthermore, there was a consistent difference in life expectancy between the sexes, with women enjoying a margin of about 5 years across all the Soviet Union years. I have very little data to draw upon for male versus male competition, so here I'm going to have to speculate a little bit. And in a book, Private Truths, Public Lies, The Social Consequences of Preference Falsification by Timur Kuran, Timur estimated that as many as several 100,000 people regularly spied on acquaintances, family, and even intimate partners. And in the book, The Unexamined Orwell by John Roden, John estimated that as many as 1 in 6.5 persons worked either as a paid or unpaid government spy. A famous case was that of Pavel Morozov, a 13-year-old boy who denounced his father to the authorities and was in turn killed by his family. This seemed to be the norm. Your co-workers would denounce you, and you would likely end up in a gulag after a quick confession and show trial. Misandry certainly existed. After all, the basic human drive to protect women did not magically disappear after the October Revolution, but the seething hatred of men we see in society today did not manifest. I speculate here that people had just simply far more pressing issues to concern themselves with, such as finding food, shelter, or simply surviving the police state being erected around them. It's also interesting to note that after coming to power, the revolutionaries enacted alimony. And this is a quote from the International Communist League. However, given women's traditional responsibilities for children and their greater difficulties in finding and maintaining employment, for them, divorce often proved more problematic than for men. For this reason, the alimony provision was established for the disabled poor of both sexes, necessary due to the inability of the states at the time to guarantee jobs for all. The 1918 Code eliminated the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate children, using instead the carefully crafted wording, children of parents who are not in a registered marriage, end quote. Thus, in the Soviet Union, women could and did claim child support from men whom they weren't married to. The family code granted individuals the right to live apart from a spouse, to divorce and receive alimony and child support. So, in reviewing the command economy, male unemployment levels, 1.5%, very low, this is super. The pair bonding dynamics, well, we have rampant divorce. Single motherhood is rampant. And the pair bonds between men and women, of course, break down. In terms of male life expectancy, between 44 to 65 years, lower than that of women. Misandry, of course, is pretty normal. You don't get the kind of insane misandry you see today in the West. Alimony certainly existed, and so did paying child support, even if she had the child against your will. In terms of male versus male competition, it was lethal. Zero brotherhood, rampant snitching. Other trade-offs, well, you had a brutal police state to contend with. I should also point out, and this statement is going to make far more sense when I publish the second and third parts in the series, that the problems tend to be exacerbated within the male half of any population when there's a shift from one economic system to another. This shift, of course, will often be inevitable, that there are simply new and better ways of doing things, or new technologies suddenly render entire industries obsolete. An example of this can be found in Stardust's video on Neolithic hypergamy, which I actually think is one of his best ever videos, and a link to this video is in the low bar. And what Stardust documented within this video was that the fact that as humans move from a hunter-gatherer society to an agrarian society, that is from a subsistence economic strategy to a barter strategy during the Neolithic era, that women sought out the relatively better off humans who had mastered agriculture, that is the male humans. This left the hunter-gatherer humans at a reproductive disadvantage due to hypergamy. The agrarian human male could offer better provisioning than his hunter-gatherer counterpart, who then faced, of course, a genetic dead end. And evidence of this, of course, can be found in the genome research that showed a large bottleneck of Y chromosome diversity that coincided with global agricultural revolution. What I will say finally is that under a resource-based system, because of the lack of money, humans will find other means to judge a man's worth and social position. In such situations, humans tend to go by reputation, who is most trustworthy, and whether we like it or not, humans do not trust unmarried men. An excellent book on this topic by Josiane Cauquelin is titled Aborigines of Taiwan, the Puyuma, From Headhunting to the Modern World. And the author, Josiane, documented the experience seen within many barter or hunter-gatherer type societies, and that is the mandate for bachelors to live apart in houses that are separated, often by great distances, from the main village. So under a barter kind of based society, the option to go one's own way leaves you at a very, very severe economic disadvantage. Also, by being childless, you'll lack many of the family-based bonds that serve as mutual protection agencies, meaning, of course, you're far more likely to die violent deaths, be subject to theft, and less likely to receive aid from your neighbors in times of famine. Within a barter-type system, marriage is not an obligation. It's actually a very, very sensible thing to do. Marrying a daughter who hails from a large family with many sons might just keep you alive if the neighboring village comes to raid or if your crops fail due to drought. And I wanted to thank you for actually sitting through this video. I know it's long, and I know I've covered a lot of information. As I said, it's going to be part of a series where myself, No Holds Barred, and TFM will be discussing the merits and disadvantages of the kind of various economic and social systems. And you may have also noticed that I've used the term economic system and social system. Sometimes I've used them interchangeably, and that's for a very good reason. A social system has a very, very specific economic system. So you can't have a command economy that is free market. It simply does not work. And there are lots and lots of reasons for that. And I'll be going into that in the subsequent videos. You cannot have a resource-based economy and have a cash society as well. Again, it's a contradiction in terms. So thank you very, very much for sitting through this. I do hope you will watch the other parts of the series, and please do leave your comments and like and subscribe and and share this video. And maybe on a kind of final note, what would I prefer to live in all of these systems? For myself personally, it would be the mixed economy. Now, you may all disagree. Some people may be just highly rugged and individualistic, and they think they'll survive well. And a barter system, good for you. I probably wouldn't. So as much as there is a lot of misandry within the kind of mixed-based economy, from the four that I've reviewed today, that seems the least bad, at least from my point of view. So thank you very, very much. This is CS MGTOW.